Welcome everyone to our webinar, Is Budget Reconciliation a Path to Climate Action? Demystifying the Congressional Budget Process. This event is hosted by republicEn.org, the Alliance for Market Solutions, and the Niskanen Center. My name is Wen Lee. I am the Engagement Director at republicEn. Thank you all so much for being here today, and we are happy to welcome our speakers, Alex Flint and Joseph Majkut. But first, let me just give you a quick outline of what to expect today. We're going to start off with a welcome and a basic overview about what budget reconciliation is. After that, our speakers will have a conversation and go into more detail about the process. And then we'll leave plenty of time for you all to ask questions. So I'm sure we're all Zoom experts at this point, but just as a reminder, there's a chat feature, which we encourage you to use. So I'm actually just going to write to everyone now, hello, and you should see a flashing notification. And this is where you can write comments and also where you will submit questions for today's speakers. So just to make sure it's working for everyone, I invite you all to type into the chat right now and say your name and where you're joining us from today. So put your name and your city and state. So I'll do that too. Ready? Go. Okay, I see Florida, Illinois, Virginia, Ohio, DC, of course. Great. I see a lot of friends that I recognize. So glad that you're all here today. Thank you so much. So as you come up with questions for our speakers at any time, you can type your questions into the chat, and Price Atkinson at republicEn will collect all of the questions. And then when we get to the Q&A, we're going to try to get through as many as we can. So as I mentioned earlier, this webinar is hosted by republicEn, and as well as the Alliance for Market Solutions, AMS, and the Niskanen Center. republicEn is a nonprofit organization for conservatives who want to solve climate change through common sense market solutions. We call our growing movement the EcoRight. And AMS and Niskanen Center are also great places for the EcoRight. So we're delighted to co-host today's event with them. Okay, well, at this time, I'm actually going to pass it over to former Congressman and republicEn's Executive Director, Bob Inglis, who's going to say a few words. Go ahead, Bob.
A very few words. Just thank you, Wen, and to introduce Chelsea, who will introduce our wonderful panelists. But I should presage by saying, you know, we on the EcoRight have some wonderfully willing compatriots, and those two of the houses of those are the Alliance for Market Solutions and the Niskanen Center. So we are very glad to have Alex and Joseph with us today, and very glad that you've joined us. So now I get to turn it over to Chelsea Henderson, who you hear on our EcoRight Speaks podcast. So now you get to see the voice that you've been hearing on the EcoRight Speaks. Chelsea.
Hello, welcome everyone. As Bob said, you might be more used to hearing my voice without seeing my face if you listen to the EcoRight Speaks podcast. If you don't, I encourage you to definitely tune in. We drop new episodes every Tuesday, and we try to bring voices that are from the EcoRight or voices that we think will be helpful to the EcoRight. So it's a really fun show to produce. You might, if you don't listen, you might also see my name in your inbox on Fridays with the Climate Week in Review, which I send out every Friday, summarizing the events of the previous week that are climate and EcoRight related. And so when Wen and Bob nominated me to moderate today, it was because I made the mistake on our staff call of saying, I hate talking about budget reconciliation because there is nothing that makes me feel more like I have imposter syndrome. So I then said, okay, fine, I'll do it. I will be a great foil because I can help stop our esteemed guests if they say something that I think is too kind of inside the beltway-ish, which is a term we use here in Washington. We have a interstate that circles around the metro area of Virginia, Maryland, and DC. So inside the beltway is kind of the term for when you're getting a little too insider baseball-y. All three of us have worked on the Hill. Four of us, Bob, Alex, Joseph, myself. So sometimes those, and Price, who you can't see, but he is our podcast producer. Sometimes when you work on the Hill, you just get used to certain terms and certain expressions being common sense. And so we're going to demystify all of that, try to bring this home to everybody. And toward that end, after I agreed to doing this, Wen said I'd have a PowerPoint. And then I almost called in sick today. But I'm going to take a second to share my screen. I promise it's 4 slides and one's an intro slide. So it will be very painless. All right, so I'm going to share, and we're going to go over here to my slides and present. So what on earth is budget reconciliation? I mean, this is me on the right. I feel this great aching sense of dread when I think about it, because I never had to do anything with it when I was on the Environment Committee. So just to kind of give you the very basics, reconciliation is a special legislative process. It allows for expedited consideration, which is what makes it special. So in the Senate in particular, the way the founding fathers created the 2 chambers, the 2 legislative bodies, the House is where the tea just comes out hot. And then in the Senate is the saucer that cools the tea. But with budget reconciliation, this is an expedited consideration, so it can't just go to die in the Senate, or there's a way to keep something from going and dying. Things die in the Senate all the time. The other special thing about reconciliation, as far as the Senate is concerned, I'm so sorry, Price calls me out all the time for being a Senate snob, and I know that I am, but budget reconciliation is not subject to the filibuster, which requires 60 votes to overcome. You only need a simple majority to pass. There are some major pieces of policy that have been that have used budget reconciliation as the train to kind of pull them along, going back to 1980, which was the first time budget reconciliation was used. Spending cuts under Reagan, deficit reduction packages, welfare reform, a lot of tax cuts, so Bush tax cuts, Trump tax cuts. And there have been times when the majority attempted to use reconciliation and didn't have even the 50 votes to do that. So lots of examples in Congress. So today we're going to really focus on can and will Senate Democrats use budget reconciliation to enact a carbon tax, which would be obviously the policy that we support here at republicEn. So that is your basis. Now I've got to figure out how to get my screen back, which I didn't ask Wen how to do. I'm going to stop sharing. All right, it tells me what to do. I'd love to introduce today's guests. So you might have heard him on the podcast in November. Alex Flint is the executive director at Alliance for Market Solutions. Before that, he has been a staff director on the Energy and Natural Resources Committee, longtime Senate staffer and expert, and he was previously senior vice president at the Nuclear Energy Institute as well. So welcome, Alex. We also have Joseph Majkut, who is the director of climate policy at the Niskanen Center. He's an expert in climate science, climate policy, risk and uncertainty analysis. And before joining Niskanen, he worked on climate change policy in Congress as well as a science fellow. And this is my favorite part. He has a PhD from Princeton in atmospheric and oceanic sciences. So he is truly a scientist, a master's degree in applied mathematics. And I have a junior in high school who is thinking about applying to college to major in math. So we might have to have a little talk, Joseph. You can tell me what to tell him to expect. So with all of that said, we're going to go ahead and turn to our guests. And I'm just going to lead things off. That was a very, very general, bare bones, what is budget reconciliation? I would love to hear from our speakers what I left out, what else our viewers here need to know to go into today's discussion. And Alex is unmuted, so I'm going to turn that to Alex.
Only to suggest that Joseph go first, unless you would prefer Joseph. So I think a couple of things. First of all, a lot of people think about reconciliation as a very complex, limited process. For those of us who have run legislation through reconciliation, the rules are wonderful. There's a fundamental trade-off between the ability to expeditiously consider legislation and in turn to limit the scope of that legislation. And if you are comfortable and knowledgeable about the rules and the legislation you are doing is the sort of legislation intended to go through the reconciliation process, it is beautiful. It is wonderful. Now, if you wander into it unaware of what the rules are, or you try to force through some sort of legislation that was not intended to go through the reconciliation process, it can be vicious and horribly unsatisfying. To those who have that experience, I just kind of grin. They should have known better at the get-go.
Alex, let me just interrupt you for a second to ask, when we talk about limiting the scope, give an example of a major piece of legislation, maybe the energy bill, for example. A big bill like that, when it is on the Senate floor, what is a ballpark figure for the number of amendments that the bill managers might have to address, or that might be filed at least?
Oh, look, when we did, gosh, it's been a while. When we did the 2003 and 2005 energy bill, we were on the floor for weeks. We had hundreds of amendments. Some of which were minor and could be dispensed of fairly quickly. You just sort of had to go through the process. Others of which took hours and hours and days of negotiations off on the side before they were dispensed with through amendments. So, depending upon that, I mean, there's huge numbers of amendments. And when you're doing a normal authorization bill, so just a regular bill that comes out of an authorizing committee or on the floor, it's very hard to limit the number of amendments. You got to file for cloture, you got to get to 60 votes, and people can first of all, recognize that in the Senate, you can offer a first degree amendment, you can offer a second degree amendment, you can offer a perfecting amendment to the second degree amendment, you can fill the amendment tree and you can jam the process up, regardless of what the actual vote count on amendments is. And so to somebody who enjoys the expeditious path that the reconciliation bill provides, it contrasts to the very cumbersome, burdensome process that a normal authorization bill needs to go through.
So toward that end, what would be allowed to be on budget reconciliation?
Well, so fundamentally, budget reconciliation is true to its name. It is a way to reconcile the spending in the country. And I'll just give you a little bit of process because it's important to be familiar with that. Two things have to happen. First of all, the House and the Senate have to adopt a budget resolution. It's not a law. It's a resolution that governs the consideration of reconciliation legislation later. It sets in place the rules by which reconciliation legislation is then considered. So budget resolution first, reconciliation legislation second. The reconciliation legislation sets total spending and total receipts for the federal government. And it does that by directing certain committees of jurisdiction to report out of those committees legislation that will increase revenue or decrease expenditures. So that, for example, the Finance Committee gets an instruction to raise $2 trillion. Senate Energy Committee gets an instruction to raise $1 billion. Finance Committee might get an instruction to cut spending by $1 trillion.
But they're not told how to do that. They're just given the instruction and then they use their expertise within that committee's jurisdiction to come up with the path.
So what will happen is there will be lots of suggestions about how they do it, but in the end, it is entirely their decision about how to do that. They report legislation that raises that amount of money, reduces that amount of entitlement spending, whatever it happens to be. The bill goes to the floor where it is then subject to expeditious consideration as long as it has met certain requirements. The requirements are generally referred to as the Byrd Rule. So as long as you don't violate the Byrd Rule, include provisions that the Byrd Rule precludes, you are fine. And at its core, provisions that the term is effectuate revenue, either raise revenue or reduce expenditures, are consistent with the reconciliation, and you can do those. If you try to do other things, authorize programs, reform other things, you run afoul of the Byrd Rule and those provisions get stricken.
Well, that makes a lot of sense. What happens if one of those committees fails to do what it was, follow its orders, so to speak?
Right. So say the budget resolution includes an instruction to the Senate Energy Committee, which I used to be the staff director of, so it's home base for me, right? So that's why I'll keep mentioning that one, to raise $1 billion in revenue. The Energy Committee can't reach agreement or just doesn't want to, so they don't report legislation in response to their reconciliation instruction. The Budget Committee gets to do it for them. Budget Committee just gets to write the energy title of reconciliation, which means the Energy Committee will do it. So the committees have a—
You're giving up your jurisdiction, basically.
So it gets done. It gets done.
What are the pros and cons of using budget reconciliation? And I think you could see these pros and cons both politically and legislatively. Or I guess using that process to do something, something dramatic, like impose a carbon tax or make a major spending cut.
At its core, it's hard to do tax and entitlement legislation, particularly if you're raising taxes and cutting entitlements. I mean, right. So just as for scope, right now, the government's annual tax take is about $3.5 trillion a year. The government spends $4.5 trillion a year, which is why we have about $1 trillion a year deficit and why the debt is approaching $28 trillion. Even when the deficits and the debt were smaller, there was a recognition that there needed to be a mechanism where the legislature could actually deal with those very difficult fiscal challenges. And that's why reconciliation was created, to create a mechanism to make the hard decisions about tax and entitlement policy. And so by setting these very strict limits, the idea was that only for tax and mandatory spending programs, entitlement programs, this process could help the Congress get to the conclusion of that process. So, you asked the question, what are the politics of that? The politics of reconciliation are really challenging because they are the very difficult issues. And no matter what policy is in there, raise taxes, cut taxes, entitlement reforms, people will assign all sorts of motives to it, and there'll be lots of discourse about it, debate about it. But recognize at its core, the country has to have a way of dealing with those challenging issues, and it has that in reconciliation, and that tool is available to things that effectuate revenue.
So turning to Joseph for a second, if you've been reading the news, if you're a junkie like probably most of us are on this webinar, and you're looking at 2021 or 2022 as potentially being a year where we could see some climate action, do you see budget reconciliation being that vehicle, Joseph, for getting some sort of climate-related policy through?
First of all, thanks for having us. Real pleasure to be here. Big fan of republicEn and Bob and my distinguished colleague, Alex. As Alex says, budget reconciliation is a procedural mechanism. It can help solve one challenge, chiefly, when you think about using it to pass policy that will also have climate implications. And that's mainly that it changes the number of votes you need to gather in the Senate, right? So it's a way of writing legislation and passing somewhat consigned legislation that doesn't require 60 votes to overcome a Senate filibuster. Given the composition of the Senate as of now, 50-50 split, that means that a lot of people are looking at it as an option to pass legislation on a purely or an almost purely partisan basis. Legislation largely written by the Democratic functional majority. So in the context that President Biden wants to do something significant about climate change, and in particular favors a model that has a lot of investment in infrastructure and clean energy, and a Congress where Democrats get to set the floor schedule, and could potentially build, gather 51 votes or 51 plus Republican support. It's something we have to consider as a tool that will be used for climate policy, whether we see it as a viable option or not. I think it's something that could come up. In the context of, can you use the federal budget to make good policy? there I think lie very interesting questions about the mechanisms we want to use to reduce greenhouse gas emissions, about the other things that might sit alongside a carbon tax or other regulations to make policies more economically efficient or more fair. There, I think there are very, very interesting issues, but I expect it to be a topic of conversation for the next 6 months to a year for sure.
Do you think it would be something then that would happen in the committee process as part of these instructions, or would it be more likely to come, like a carbon tax, for example, would it be more likely to come as a floor amendment?
I'm not sure that I can confidently, yeah, I don't know that I can confidently state exactly how you would expect things to go. Yeah. I think, and the procedural specifics might be less instructive than thinking carefully about what is it that people who might vote for or might oppose such a thing want. Right. And if you want to find a way to reduce greenhouse gas emissions, then something like a carbon tax, as your Republican supporters know, is efficient. And it just so happens that it is largely a budgetary mechanism, right? You don't have to create a big new department or a big new program to levy a carbon price. And so, a wise person, when I got to Washington, D.C., told me that policy, legislative change is always a matter of politics, procedure, and the policy that you want to forward. And successful legislative change always relies on some combination of those three factors. Alex is nodding. He probably heard that speech at one point too. I
learned it by myself. It's true.
and so I think the rich conversation is can this procedural mechanism give you good policy, and what are the political considerations that would feed into a successfully implementing good policy, or, as has happened in the past, successfully implementing subpar policy.
So looking at this 50-50 split in the Senate, and this is for either one of you who has some insight, which senators do you think are going to be at the forefront of budget reconciliation? And I know senators, probably all of them in some regard, obviously will want to play their role, but who should we be looking to for the leadership that needs to be exerted?
My experience with senators says that all of them are going to be critical to the legislative process. I think, Alex described the process by which budget reconciliation commences, and it is, correct me if I'm wrong, Alex, but I think it's a process that's driven at the committee level. And so I would pay attention to, and I think we all need to think about, who are the principal people leading the committees of jurisdiction for energy and climate issues, for tax issues, and for budgetary issues generally. So that in this context would be Senator Sanders is the budget chairman. Senator Wyden is seating the Finance Committee. Senator Carper leads the EPW Committee, and Senator Manchin leads the Energy and Natural Resources Committee. And they would all be involved in responding to budget instructions should those committees get instructions from the Budget Committee.
So do we see budget reconciliation happening in a bipartisan manner? Like, has it happened that way in the past? And looking, so 2000 was the last time we had a 50-50 Senate. I mean, I'm very diplomatic. So looking at the way the Senate is structured now, I sort of feel like, well, wouldn't you want to, for example, Manchin should be talking to Barrasso and figuring out together what they would want to do on the Energy Committee. And I don't know who the ranking member is on finance, not Grassley. Who's ranking on finance? Crapo, maybe? Whoever's ranking over that there's some, that it behooves you to work together, but we don't live in that reality, especially right now in these kind of hyper-partisan times. So has this process been used in a bipartisan manner in the past? And, again, crystal balling a little bit, what do you guys think the prospects are for this particular year, seeing it be bipartisan?
So, Joseph, can I go?
Yes.
Chelsea, I think the answer is we just don't know. And so we have to be prepared for any number of eventualities. A lot of us, for example, were very hopeful when the 10 Republican senators went down to meet with President Biden at the White House that there would be a bipartisan agreement on the COVID package. I worked in the Senate for a long period of time, and I know that the reports that Senator Biden has very good personal relationships with senators, regardless of party, is true. And I'm certainly one who is hoping that there would be an outbreak of bipartisanship. And I'm quite disappointed that that seems to have fallen by the wayside. And now there will be an effort to do the next COVID relief package purely in a partisan way using the reconciliation process. I do not know if that's the end of efforts on bipartisanship. I hope that there are subsequent efforts on bipartisanship. My personal inclination is to credit President Biden with desiring that. And so we have to see what will happen. I think right now, we have to, it's very early days. We're only just beginning to see. I mean, one of the things I thought was most interesting, and I'm going inside the Beltway on this one, Chelsea, but one of the interesting things when we saw those 10 Republican senators reach out to the White House, those of us who really follow it wanted to know, who did they call? Was it Kamala Harris, the vice president, who brokered that? Or was it Brian Deese, the National Economic Advisor? Who is it that's actually helping to shape these things and is having the conversations among the senators to help facilitate some sort of bipartisanship? We haven't figured out who the key players are on those big strategic decisions, much less in the climate space. We'll get a better sense of that. And you also have to recognize that right now, we are going to have moments of highly partisan rhetoric and legislation. And so the real issue is, like, can we recover from that enough at some point to do a bipartisan, maybe an infrastructure bill? What happens on the defense bill? What happens in the lead up to Glasgow? Is there an effort to be bipartisan there? Also, if we go hyper-partisan on this next COVID relief package, does it empower a group on the far left, the progressives, who get really difficult and start making unreasonable requests, and all of a sudden the opportunity for a group of moderate Republicans gets larger because moderate Democrats need moderate Republicans to do a deal because they don't like where the really progressive Democrats are. So look, long way of thinking, like, we don't know. I mean, I think one of the things that Joseph and I, having done this for a little bit, think, like, if you decide there's only one path through the legislative process, it's not the right way to go. You have to be ready that the opportunities may present themselves.
And while we have a 50-50 split in terms of how people align themselves with the political parties, I think if you look at ideologically where people stand, that there's more of a gray area in the middle, right? So you have Senator Manchin, probably the most conservative Democrat, and then you have Susan Collins and Lisa Murkowski and Republicans that might be to the left of him. So how, in that kind of situation, let's just presume that some of the partisanship kind of dies down a little bit. How much are the leaders really requiring their members, like, you got to stand in line and stick with the troops? Or can a Manchin decide to vote no, but then a Murkowski vote? Like, how much fluidity do you think there can be?
So you have to let me answer this quick, and then Joseph, you go. Look, Senator Manchin deserves credit for being the first one to realize that in a 50-50 Senate, every vote counts. Look, I've been in the majority leader's office when a senator has come in and said, "Leader, I'll vote with you as long as you do this." It's like a 50-person hostage-taking exercise every day in the Senate. I mean, Manchin's willing to break off on things. I'll bet there's 12 members that people are going to have to watch with an eagle eye going forward. Everyone trying to take advantage of the opportunity. So it's not a static thing. And Senator Manchin deserves a lot of credit for realizing he was important, but his vote counts just as much as anybody else's vote. They're all going to be in there negotiating votes one way or the other on things.
Joseph, do you want to add your 2 cents?
It's only a compliment to Alex's answer to say that every senator gets to vote in line with their personal judgment. And I think that makes every Senate vote important.
Yeah.
Well, I think that we should go ahead and turn it over to some of our participants today to see what sort of questions they have, because I know that mine might be a little bit too inside the beltway. I'm trying to anticipate what people are thinking. So Wen, are you ready with some questions?
Yeah, sure. We've got a couple. And again, everyone who's listening, go ahead and submit any questions you have into the chat. Make sure it's addressed to everyone's, and then we will collect them and go through as many as we can. But let's see. First question is from Marianne. And she asks, She says, it looks like they are going to use budget reconciliation to do COVID response soon. So when is the earliest that they could consider using reconciliation again for climate issues, including a carbon tax?
Ooh, actually, that's a great question because, and I have to interrupt for a second. I, in my mind, had this question, didn't ask it. We keep hearing about reconciliation now and reconciliation later on in the year, but isn't there normally only budget reconciliation once, right? You do the budget one time. Why are there two bites at the apple in 2021?
Normally there's only one reconciliation bill, or normally there's only one budget resolution, which establishes the rules for consideration of reconciliation. Reconciliation normally addresses revenue, expenditures, and the debt limit, and can be combined into one or can be divided up into as many as 3 different bills. This year, because we didn't do one last year, we basically have one left over. So we've got sort of a mulligan that's available out there for what's happening with COVID package. The normal process for budget resolution, the sort of the base case, is budget resolution is developed in the spring, passes, gets agreed to around Memorial Day, reconciliation process kicks off, bumps up against the August recess, you get your deals done in September, October, and from in climate space, you think about it as completing reconciliation in advance of Glasgow, something along that. That's like your base case. What's happening right now on COVID relief is the anomaly. There could be other anomalies. Joseph, about right? That's
Yeah, that accords with my thinking. If we see this as a present issue for climate, I expect that to start in the springtime.
So to answer her question, it might be in the spring. That we
begin in the spring.
Begins in the spring.
Mm-hmm. Okay. Let's see. We have a question from Alex Bosmosky, another Alex. He says, what was the deal with that Hoeven? Is it Hoeven Amendment? I don't know if I'm pronouncing it right. What is the deal with the Hoeven Amendment during Votorama? 50-50 rejected, but R's flirting with a carbon tax voted for it, and D is skeptical of a carbon tax voted against it. I have no idea what he's talking about, but do you?
I think he's violating your inside the Beltway ban, and we should ignore it.
This is why Alex Bosmosky is not moderating today.
Wait, someone says it's a good question. Christopher seconds that question.
On the budget resolution for COVID, Senator Hoeven offered an amendment that would have raised a 60-vote point of order against any subsequent legislation that included a carbon tax. It's on the budget resolution, not on the reconciliation bill, but it would have limited future legislation. It was rejected on a party line vote. Most amendments on budget resolutions are rejected on party line votes. So Hoeven offered it, supported it. It made Joe Manchin put out sort of a tortured statement about he was going to oppose it, although he hated carbon taxes. And there was one other statement that was issued. I forget who it was by right now. I think the bottom line is it tells you carbon tax is controversial, but it doesn't affect any future consideration at this point. It's part of the rhetoric that's associated with budget resolutions, and you get lots of it.
Cool. Bob, did you want to ask your question?
Yes. So it's the question about whether the bird rule would prevent the recycling of carbon tax revenue into a reduction in the FICA tax, the payroll tax. So just in case everybody's not following that, people like us, conservatives, want to put on a carbon tax, but we'd love for it to be revenue neutral, in other words, not grow the government. So one way to do that is to pair it with a reduction in payroll taxes, the FICA tax. But that FICA tax funds Social Security. So the question is whether that runs afoul of the bird rule.
So, Bob, you again ask a question which is flirting with inside baseball, but the bird rule sets a variety of standards. I think there are 7. I can't remember the specific number though. I think it's 7. For what Senator Byrd in his wisdom argued should sit outside the reconciliation process. And one of them was effectuating changes to Social Security. Now, I agree. We've worked together and cheered for members who are introducing bills to swap carbon taxes and payroll taxes. There's a strong economic argument for doing that. There's a strong jobs argument for doing that. But since payroll taxes directly fund the Social Security Trust, there's a question as to whether or not that would offend the spirit of the Byrd Rule, if not the actual Byrd Rule. And I think that I'm actually not confident about giving you a strong answer, because there might be a way to design a bill to do that would be deemed in compliance with the Byrd Rule. And I think this is one of the things that makes reconciliation both frustrating from an external view and also exciting, in that no one's quite sure how the Byrd Rule should be applied, because it's applied to the way you write the legislation is written. It's applied when points of order are raised, and the Senate parliamentarian is the person that the Senate trusts to judge whether or not specific provisions are in order or in violation of the Byrd Rule. There are two things I think it's worth thinking about in this context. One is the Senate, in its wisdom, does not have to, technically, though it hasn't been done before. They haven't overruled the parliamentarian before. They don't technically have to follow it. It's guidance. It's not a strict rule. And the second thing is, I don't know if the right way to think about it, and Alex I know has thoughts on this too. The right way to think about budget reconciliation is doing anything like swapping one tax for another. When you write a budget legislation by budget reconciliation, you write provisions that do a lot of things. The Tax Cuts and Jobs Act of 2017 was passed through budget reconciliation. It did a lot of things. None of them were specific legislative trades of the kind you're talking about. They were a whole package of legislative changes that ended up changing revenues and spending in line with budget instructions. So the right way to think about it is, what is the whole package of changes that goes on? And is it possible to make changes to the labor tax as long as the Social Security Trust Fund is being otherwise funded? I don't know that anybody can confidently tell you, but it's something that you likely a legislator would want to be wary of, for sure.
And I just wanted to ask, in the context of what you just said, for those participants in this webinar who aren't familiar with who the parliamentarian is and what their role is. This is a person that works on the Senate floor, and they have all of the arcane knowledge of floor procedure and rules in their heads, right? So they're the ones that decide, but don't they typically work with the majority leader's staff so if the majority leader wanted to do something, typically the parliamentarian is going to help them figure out how to word things, right? No, Alex is shaking his head.
Not enough to make the majority leader like the parliamentarian. Let me put it to you this way. So what actually happens is, what you'll see on the floor of the Senate when a reconciliation bill is pending is a member will go up and say, Mr. President, addressing the presiding officer, I raise a point of order that section such and such violates the Byrd Rule. I'll call it the Byrd Rule now. It's a technical term, but the Byrd Rule. The parliamentarian who's sitting in front of the presiding officer would then spin around in their chair and whisper to the presiding officer whether or not the provision violates the Byrd Rule. Okay. And in every case to date, the presiding officer has agreed with the parliamentarian and issued that ruling. And if the point of order is sustained, the provision is stripped immediately. Now, the backstory to that is that in advance of that happening, as that provision is being written in committees, the staff will be sitting in the parliamentarian's office trying to find out if a point of order against it would be sustained. The parliamentarian will not issue an advisory opinion. They only rule when the point of order is made on the floor of the Senate. So, and I have sat in the parliamentarian's office for hours on end, like looking for body language, like if this happened. And what the parliamentarian says, I want to hear the debate on the floor, and I'm only going to issue, it's like the Supreme Court. We don't do advisory opinions. We rule upon the issues. And so, and all the way back to Bob's point, like I can definitely write a carbon tax, payroll tax swap that violates the Byrd Rule. No question. I can do that. That's easy to do. You could also write those two provisions in two separate parts of the bill and write them in such a way that they might both individually withstand a Byrd Rule point of order. I don't know the answer to that. I can tell you, you can write it so that it would be subject to a Byrd Rule point of order. You can mess it up, but there's a lot of crafting that goes on in this process, which is why, all the way back to an earlier question that you asked, Chelsea, about who matters, the committee chairmen really dominate this process because they, to Joseph's point earlier, they understand the process limits very well. They've got the staff to do the, not negotiations with parliamentarians, because parliamentarians don't negotiate, but to sit there and read the body language. And when somebody else comes to the floor with an amendment, like a carbon tax amendment on the floor, it's really hard for them to have done it right. So the real play in this entire process is in the committees. Anyway.
Well, to that point, and I'm just going to overtake Wen for a second, who is is filtering the questions, but our dear friend Bosmowski asked if Harris isn't more important than Byrd in this case because could she overrule the parliamentarian and make anything work as the 51st vote?
So Chelsea, I've had some of my progressive friends say that the progressives have realized that reconciliation only takes 50 votes and that they can get anything through the reconciliation process if there is a progressive in the chair who simply ignores the advice of the parliamentarian.
Has that ever happened?
No, and I don't take that. Admittedly, the parliamentarian just turns around and whispers the advice, and the chair can ignore that advice. I mean, just in theory, right? My personal view is that would be the last piece of legislation out of the Congress. Like, the system would melt down. It would be like saying, like, guys, we're going to waive all the rules about driving on the roads. There'd be crashes every which way you can possibly imagine. I frankly think that's something people who don't understand the reconciliation process have come up with that is just not actually a real possibility. It would end the Senate as we know it.
I'm having this visual in my mind of everything crumbling. I'm going to put two questions together because they're both having to do with the clean energy standard. So Dave and Peter both asked about this. So Dave asks, Peter asks, do you think a national clean energy standard would fall within or run afoul of the Byrd Rule? How and why? And Dave asks, if some Democrats are skeptical of a carbon tax, are there enough Republican votes to get a clean electricity standard done in reconciliation?
I'll take the first one, you take the second, or you go first. You go first, but I'll go after you, Joseph.
The way in which we talk about budget reconciliation is largely anticipating a partisan vote. And so I'm not sure that, we're in a position where we can count how, is there enough Republican votes for one policy or another again, policy, politics, policy, procedure, and politics in a process that's largely going to be driven by Democratic legislators trying to achieve not just climate policy goals, but probably other ones as well. So I don't close the door on that option. As Alex says, we should be ready for anything. But I don't know that you can make a meaningful count about any particular line item in a reconciliation package. Likewise, I get frustrated with crystal ball reading on, would Senator Manchin support a carbon tax under reconciliation? I don't know. Is he going to support the reconciliation package that everybody else in his party's put together and the president wants him to sign? I don't know. Regarding the clean electricity standard, it's like Alex says, I could easily write one that would run afoul of the rules for budget reconciliation. I have yet to convince myself that I could write one that is meaningfully different from something like a carbon price that would make it through the rules of reconciliation if I got my conditionals right.
And I agree with your conditionals if I understood them. I will put myself on the very dubious, in very dubious camp about a clean energy standard in reconciliation. I have heard some people talk about the government administering a fee sale and purchase scheme to create a cap and then charging a fee that would generate revenue, and that revenue being a justification for including the totality of the program in reconciliation. But there is actually a point of order against large pieces of legislation that simply have an incidental impact on revenue. So you can't do that. And I'll put this contention out that I'm very comfortable about. If you were to torture a clean energy standard enough to get it through the reconciliation process, it would be a tortured, weird clean energy standard. I'd say that even reluctantly, because I don't see how you can do it. I mean, I don't. There is one report that had one co-author who I respect on reconciliation and bird rule issues that I no longer say there is zero chance, but I don't see how you make it work. And remember, you'd have to write your clean energy standard so that it didn't violate the bird rule, and so that it had enough support to just stand on its own, right? So how you deal with that, with regional disparities in the electricity generation system, I don't get it.
Yeah, and that speaks to the function of reconciliation is reconciling the federal budget. It's not meant to be a tool to add new mechanisms of governance to between the state and the people, right? So, and you can kind of, recent history might make it's easy to make that mistake, right? So the Affordable Care Act passed when there was a supermajority in the Senate and Democrats were able to force it through on a partisan basis. Then they used reconciliation to change some of the terms, but it didn't create new government functions, the reconciliation bit. It just changed the numbers around a little bit. And so unless you're talking about activities that are already included in things like the tax code, or already places where the government has offices that can spend money, you're not, it's not really within the spirit of what the thing was designed to do. And so you end up sort of hacking your way there, and you might be able to do that via the rules, but it's, that's not really what the mechanism is intended to do.
Yeah, especially for in this context with the people on this call, a carbon tax is clearly can be done within the reconciliation process. There's no question about that. Now, there are then secondary questions about to what extent can you direct the use of the revenue? To what extent can you cut other taxes, head towards revenue neutrality, do a dividend? There are those, I'll call them secondary issues. But the core issue of can you use reconciliation to enact new tax law? Absolutely. And that's what makes this interesting. You still have the same issues about can you design a carbon tax that A is good policy and B gets the votes necessary to do it. But if you're thinking about reconciliation and climate policy, a carbon tax is so much more straightforward that it's almost not fair to torture those of us who do reconciliation to try to figure out a way to get a clean energy standard in, because it's just such a horrid fit if it fits at all. Sorry, Joe. I can't help myself. I'm an hour into this. I'm starting to speak too fast.
I like the idea of those of us who work under reconciliation.
Okay, let's see. Another question from Nader. So under the bird rule, reconciliation bills can't be projected to increase the federal deficit after 10 years. Does the same apply to increasing federal revenue? How might that impact a carbon price's ability to deeply decarbonize our economy? Saying no.
It's a point of order. It's a point of order against losses of revenue or about increases in the deficit outside the 10-year window. So the question asks, no, you can raise more money. As the legislative branch has never had that problem, actually being fiscally responsive. No, it's not.
All right. Oh, sorry.
No, you go ahead, Wayne.
Okay. Let's see. So Tom asks about the dividend option. So you talked about the viability of using a carbon tax with other tax offsets. So what about a carbon tax with citizen dividend? Could that be done under reconciliation?
I missed the question. My internet dropped, sorry.
Oh, so discussion has centered on carbon tax with other federal tax offsets. What about a carbon tax with dividend, citizen dividend?
Oh.
Could that be done under reconciliation?
Again, could that be done under reconciliation is a tough thing to ask. I believe so. you can set up spending programs, or you could augment existing spending programs to kind of functionally achieve a dividend, because you're setting spending levels. You might run into issues of matching and changing the deficit over the long term, but it shouldn't be too heavy of an issue. Lots of other transfers, the EITC, the child tax credit, have been adjusted using budget reconciliation. So increasing government transfers of various kinds is something that's been done before.
Yeah, and I would say, so the easy thing is you can raise a certain amount of money. You can give back less than that much money, not all of it, because then you're just raising an incidental amount of money, but you can give back some portion of it. It's very easy to give it back through increases in the EITC or the child care tax credit or existing tax code. It gets a little harder to create a new program, which is a dividend program. I think you could probably do it. You could mess it up. I mean, if you did the two provisions absolutely together and returned 100% of the revenue, you would have no effect on the federal government, on tax collections. So you wouldn't, and so you wouldn't effectuate revenue. So the provision would be fault. But if you separated the two, you can come close to it. I think it's in play. It's one of those, you can mess it up or you could come pretty close to it.
Great, thanks. And Chelsea, were you going to say something?
I was just going to say, so going back to this idea that if there was going to be a carbon tax in reconciliation and it's going to be like a super partisan thing, I guess you would want to make sure that like this is the one bite at the apple and partisanship is going to reign from here on out after doing something so big like that, that you would want that carbon tax to actually be big then, right? Like it's not really worth it to do it for like $15 a ton. You would want to really get your biggest bang for your buck if you were actually going to do it.
Chelsea, I had that discussion with somebody yesterday who was genuinely asking, are the politics different at $15 and $35? I actually don't know the answer to that question. I mean, there's one theory that you can do a low carbon tax and get more support for it. There's another theory that the votes are exactly the same, so you might as well put in a price that A, addresses the problem, and B, the revenue can be used to do something more meaningful. I could even postulate that if you do a really low carbon tax, you lose the support of some people who really want to address climate. I think the answer to this question is like the answers to a lot of questions, which is you figure this out by going in and sitting down with senators and saying, where would you be on the following? And you just got to start to piece it together. Because I don't speak for any senators, but the Sheldon White House, I think his legislation last year was at $52 a ton. So if you come in at 15, does Sheldon say, no, that's not enough? Or does he say, okay, this is a good starting point? And I just don't know. I mean, until it's ripe and we actually go in and have those conversations and try to see what the deal is, I just don't think you can answer the question.
All right, we have 4 minutes left, and we'll see if we can jam in 2 questions. Could a border adjustment rule be included in budget reconciliation?
My view is
I agree. I think so.
My view is failure to include it would result in industry moving offshore. You therefore would lose the revenue off of the carbon tax. As a result, that provision would score positively, therefore meets the Bird rule test. I think you can put a border adjustment mechanism in.
Well, yeah, I mean, just by the nature that we, a neutral border adjustment, meaning we rebate exports and we tariff imports for their carbon content. By the nature of us being a carbon consuming nation, you would score positively. And there were similar adjustments in the 2017 Tax Cuts and Jobs Act relating to transfers of profits abroad.
Great. And that question was from Jean. Thanks, Jean. It's a good question.
That is a really good question.
Okay, I'm going to try to do Christopher and Jacob together, even though they're not totally similar. But so Christopher asks if you think there's a durability concern with using reconciliation, considering the controversial nature of a carbon tax and the ability to undo it through future reconciliation. And Jacob asks if you're concerned that if there's a major push to pass carbon tax through the process and it fails, that carbon pricing as a policy will be poisoned moving forward.
because it's really popular right now. It's a good policy, and under a lot of conditions, it's quite popular. Though the legislature, in its wisdom, hasn't given us one yet. I think this is an important thing for all of us to think about, right? Nobody in this, Niskanen Center, republicEn, AMS, we've all for years argued that a carbon price it's a compromise solution, right? It's a conciliant solution. It's a place where you can come together and do policy right. Obviously, and fix the politics of climate, right? In the meantime, obviously, this is a very different procedure that we're talking about. It's a very different set of legislators that you might think about targeting or talking to, and being concerned about their opinions. The dynamics shuffle a lot. My general sense is we should support, I support good policies where it's being made. And I think as an analyst and as a public commentator, I can confidently say you can make a pretty decent carbon tax via budget reconciliation if you wanted to. Questions of long-term durability come, what can be done by reconciliation can be undone by reconciliation. But a carbon tax passed with 70 votes can be zeroed out by reconciliation as well. So if we can design good policy via any mechanism, and if its durability can come from outside coalitional interests saying, hey, we like this is not so bad, that might not be a bad way to go.
I agree.
Okay. Well, we are at time. So I wanted to thank Alex and Joseph so much for your wisdom. Thank you, Chelsea, for moderating. I hope everyone appreciated and learned a lot through this conversation. I certainly did. I want to let everyone know that we'll be sending up a follow-up email with a recording, and we'll also be sending websites for republicEn and Niskanen and AMS so you can learn more about our organizations. But thank you all for joining us for this policy talk. And I hope.
May I offer one thing?
Oh, absolutely. Go for it.
I just want to plug, I wrote a piece yesterday in appreciation of George Schultz, who I know many of us knew and loved. He passed away recently. So, just keep him in mind, and as we go about our work and the dedication he had to our country.
I'll include that in the follow-up email so people can read it. Any last words, Alex? You're good. Chelsea, Bob? All right.
Just thank you to Alex and Joseph, and great job, Chelsea and Wynn, and thank you everybody for joining us. Let's see a way to get this done. So thanks for our partners at Niskanen and Alliance for Market Solutions for co-sponsoring this with us.
All right. Have a good day, everyone. Thank you so much. Bye now.